she's black, she's everything. You can be more than one thing. It's incredible. You know, I'm Jewish and Irish. I wish I was black. Every white Jewish guy wishes he was black.
I take responsibility.
I take responsibility.
I take responsibility.
And I want very much to live on the right side of history, and I'm an immigrant. My parents are refugees from Chile.
I don't understand. I'm so sorry. I wish I could do something, but I can't. I don't know what to do.
I think the world should consider my president as public enemy #1 at this point.
It's our time to have wage equality once and for all and equal rights for women in the United States of America.
On June 2020, Instagram flooded overnight. Influencers, actors, producers, almost every face you'd seen on a movie poster or red carpet posted the same image, a blank dark void. This became known as Blackout Tuesday. The moment crystallized something, not the birth of virtue signaling that had been brewing long before, but its full institutionalization. The rules had changed. Activism went from being an accessory to becoming part of the job description. Studios, talent agencies, even craft services, everyone needed to be aligned. Say the right thing, support the right cause, get in line. But once signaling became standard, once it was baked into contracts, press tours, and green light meetings, the question stopped being, what are they saying? And became, why are they all saying the same thing? It's one of the many reasons why people say Hollywood lost its magic, but that's technically not true. It didn't really lose it. It just handed it over, not all at once and not to who you might think. It wasn't a coup from writers or directors or even activists, really. The takeover started far upstream with something invisible, investment memos, ESG ratings, and a letter written by a man you've probably never heard speak out loud.
Apple roared into the TV game with a morning show, a superb drama about the importance of dignity and doing the right thing, made by a company that runs sweatshops in China. So, well, you say you're woke, but the companies you work for, I mean, unbelievable. Apple, Amazon, Disney. If ISIS started a streaming service, you'd call your agent, wouldn't you?
Hollywood doesn't believe in God, but it prays anyway, not to the God you know, not even to the audience. What it prays to is capital, and capital now has a moral code.
Please welcome Andrew Ross Sorkin and his guest, the chairman and CEO of BlackRock, Larry Fink.
Meet Larry Fink. He's not a studio executive, doesn't greenlight movies or sit in a writer's room, but when he speaks, CEOs across America sit up straight. As head of BlackRock, a firm managing over $10 trillion in assets, he controls more money than the GDP of France, the UK, and Italy combined. But why is he important? In 2018, he sent a letter to corporate America called A Sense of Purpose, and it told companies they needed to serve a social purpose if they wanted continued access to capital. Profit alone wouldn't cut it anymore. If you wanted continued investment, you'd need to prove your virtue. Most Americans never saw that letter, but every executive in Hollywood did. Blockbusters are very risky bets. When one flops, it burns through hundreds of millions. They need the goodwill of the money men to keep the lights on. The real business model in Hollywood is dead. Hundreds of millions borrowed against the hope that the third reboot of a collapsing franchise will be just familiar enough to keep international markets awake. But when the gatekeepers of that money stop measuring you by ticket sales and start grading you by your compliance with abstract social metrics, you stop thinking about what audiences want. You start thinking about what Larry wants. That's how you end up with Disney creatives bragging on leaked Zoom calls about this.
Leadership over there has been so welcoming to my not at all secret gay agenda. And so I feel like wherever I could, just basically adding queerness to if you see anything queer in the show, I'm proud family. But I just was like, no one would stop me and no one
A moment that told the truth accidentally. Storytelling had slipped to the back of the line. Entertainment was out. Messaging was in. Now, I won't pretend Hollywood was ever apolitical. From Mr. Smith Goes to Washington to Platoon, ideology has always had a seat at the table, but, and this is a huge but, those films were still trying to tell great stories. But now, it's story as delivery mechanism. The message comes first, the characters, dialogue, and structure just wrap around it. So what does that have to do with Larry Fink? Simple. when studios noticed that their largest institutional shareholders weren't evaluating them based on ticket sales or streaming numbers, but on ideological compliance and stakeholder capitalism, they adapted accordingly. Suddenly, producing a film wasn't just about making it good, it was about checklists. Did your cast represent a certain demographic breakdown? Did your themes promote a particular worldview? Did your corporate DEI training satisfy institutional shareholders who hadn't watched a movie in a decade? You might be tempted to think this is conspiracy talk, but here's what actually happened. Within 3 years of Fink's letter, 92% of S&P 500 companies, yes, nearly every major corporation, began publishing ESG reports. Now, ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. Sounds harmless enough, but in practice, it's a scoring system used by massive investment firms to rate companies based on how well they align with progressive political and cultural goals. They basically tell a company, lower your emissions, diversify your board, echo the right values, or risk losing funding. That's the deal. And when $10 trillion says jump, corporate America doesn't ask why. They ask how high. Disney, Warner, Universal, every major studio now dances to that tune. They have to. Their access to capital depends on it. But the contradiction here is the studios act like they're leading a movement when they're just following capital. They frame themselves as moral innovators, but every step is dictated by investor mood swings. There's nothing revolutionary about conforming to the demands of your largest stakeholders. But while studios were tailoring their content to appease ESG scorecards, their audience was voting in a different language: silence. Disney's stock dropped from $201 to $85 between 2021 and 2022, and within that time, we saw the biggest flops in the company's history. And despite all the flops and box office bombs, the message kept coming. A more market-minded industry might have paused, asked questions, but remember, these weren't market decisions anymore. They were compliance decisions. And this was laid bare in 2024. Disney's CEO Bob Iger declared that the company would focus on entertainment, not messaging. Literally a few hours later, the studio announced a female Silver Surfer. You couldn't script a better parody. Iger was trying to hedge, placate the people who buy the tickets and the people who control the credit. But when those two groups want different things, neutrality becomes cowardice. And we all know how Hollywood execs are practically allergic to choosing sides unless someone else chooses first. But Hollywood's choice is clear, has been for years. Major studios now employ sensitivity readers, people whose job is to read scripts and flag anything deemed politically problematic. Think of them as internal censors appointed by the ESG conscious executives worried about an activist shareholder revolt. In 2021, the top 3 institutional shareholders, BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard, owned a combined 20% or more of nearly every media conglomerate. That kind of ownership gives them outsized voting power on board decisions. And with that power comes influence on hiring, on diversity policies, on executive compensation, and yes, on creative output. And so if every studio feels like it's making the same movie with slightly different actors, they probably are, because they're all playing to the same judge, and you're watching an industry desperately trying to sync its content with a moral index it didn't write.
Empathy is not weak or woke. And by the way, woke just means you give a damn about other people.
In 2020, Gina Carano was fired from The Mandalorian after posting a, let's say, politically provocative meme. It wasn't obscene, wasn't even offensive by pre-2015 internet standards, but it clashed with the dominant ideological orthodoxy inside the company. She was dropped almost immediately. Disney couldn't afford to appear out of step with the cultural expectations set by the same activist investors scrutinizing their ESG reports. And so, what began as a financial trend, ESG investing, stakeholder capitalism, ended up warping the content millions of people turn to for escape. And while box office receipts shrink and audience trust erodes, studios stay the course. Because again, they're no longer judged by the audience. They're judged by frameworks created in skyscrapers thousands of miles away from the sets, written by people who will never sit through a 2-hour superhero movie in a Kansas City multiplex. Now, this isn't a culture war in the way people usually frame it. It's mostly just a supply chain issue. When capital itself gets politicized, everything downstream, media, education, corporate hiring, starts aligning to the same incentives. And Hollywood goes from producing culture to manufacturing compliance. It would almost be tolerable if Hollywood's only sin were being out of touch, another elite industry fumbling its way through relevance. But that's not enough for them. They can't just fail quietly. They have to fail righteously. They have to insist on broadcasting their virtue because they think moral grandstanding can cover for creative bankruptcy. And that whole phase has given birth to a whole new industry.
So, if you do win an award tonight, don't use it as a platform to make a political speech, right? You're in no position to lecture the public about anything. You know nothing about the real world.
ESG scores were supposed to be a compass, a way to align capital with conscience, but in practice, and like every other progressive doctrine, they're just another shell game. Companies chasing optics instead of outcomes, oil giants touting diversity stats while drilling new wells, streaming platforms celebrating carbon neutrality while serving content off data centers powered by coal or gas. It's all signal, no substance. And the entertainment world latched on like it always does to turn boardroom compliance into red carpet virtue. And just like that, the language of ethics got hijacked by people who treat morality as set dressing. And it always, always starts with applause. Not yours, probably. But somewhere, someone is clapping, usually in a theater or on Facebook or at an award show where the dress code is activist but couture. A millionaire accepts a trophy, says something about justice.
Sit back and watch. We have to act, and we have to act now.
But you're supposed to feel something. Maybe pride, maybe awe. What you probably feel instead is fatigue, not because you're against justice. I mean, who could be against justice? But because something about the whole performance feels empty. Because you know you're watching someone do an impression of sincerity. You know they don't believe what they're saying either. Not really, they're just playing the part. And no moment captured that dissonance quite like that strange mid-pandemic fever dream known as the Imagine video.
Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try.
No hell below us.
It's March 2020. The world is locked down. People are stuck inside apartments with peeling drywall, jobless, scared, disinfecting cereal boxes. And here comes Gal Gadot singing about no possessions from an apartment that probably costs more than that you make in 5 years. After her, a parade of equally out-of-touch celebrities join in, each of them swaying slightly off-key, each of them insulated from the chaos the rest of us were choking on. Maybe they meant well, maybe, but meaning well doesn't land when it's wrapped in that much unearned comfort. What was intended as unity became satire. They wanted to remind us we were all in this together, from the safety of their guest house saunas. But 2020, being the ultimate year of cringe, gave us so much more.
Every time I explained away police brutality or turned a blind eye, I take responsibility.
In June, as streets across the country erupted in protests, Hollywood answered the call with a black and white video titled, "I Take Responsibility." Actors who've made careers pretending to feel things, now pretending to feel bad, about racism, about silence, about something. It was vague by design, every shot delivered like a eulogy. But guilt, especially guilt without cost, has a short shelf life in Hollywood, so it mutates, shifts into other forms. When Elon Musk became the avatar for Wrongthink, Alyssa Milano did what any self-respecting activist influencer hybrid might do. She sold her Tesla and proudly tweeted that she replaced it with a Volkswagen EV. But Volkswagen was a Nazi project, literally born from Hitler's dream of a people's car. That part didn't make the tweet, because for Milano, the gesture mattered more than the substance, the optics more than the origin. That's the thread, visibility over virtue. It's not about what's true, but always about what plays. Ryan Reynolds and his wife Blake Lively apologized for holding their wedding at Boone Hall Plantation, 8 years after the fact. The venue had been a plantation when they booked it in 2012, a plantation when they posted the photos, a plantation when the wedding trended on Pinterest, but it only became a problem once 2020 made everything flammable. And Reynolds called the decision a giant effing mistake. Selena Gomez released this video that went completely viral, and the following months, she appeared at the Oscars draped in luxury fabric that cost more than most of those families will earn in a decade. But it wasn't the dress that betrayed the message, it was the whiplash. The emotional velocity from grief to glamour, with no stop in between. You can't post about the border one day and walk the carpet the next and expect no one to notice the wardrobe change. And still, the contradictions only get worse with youth. Rachel Zegler turned her platform into a bullhorn. At one point, she tweeted that Trump supporters should never know peace, a line that might pass in a college protest at Columbia, but hits different when you're promoting a billion-dollar family brand. There's a tension there, selling innocence on screen while preaching vengeance online. It's a little hard to play the fairest of them all when half your audience is on your block list. But rage has always been fashionable among the resistance. Mark Hamill told fans to go force yourselves because of their voting choices. Robert De Niro can't order a coffee without slipping into a full-blown anti-Trump monologue.
He's an embarrassment to this country. It makes me so angry that this country has gotten to this point, that this fool, this bozo, has wound up where he has.
Basically turned deranged anti-Trump rants into his primary form of communication. Amanda Stenberg made a music video to own her own fans, and if there's a brain-dead, virtue-soaked progressive take floating around, you can bet Mark Ruffalo and Pedro Pascal are already sobbing into their oat milk about it. What ties these moments together isn't really ideology, but performance, public morality as theater, the kind where the script changes mid-scene and no one remembers the last act. And what makes it feel uncanny, even dreamlike, is that every gesture is done with full confidence that it means something, that the act itself is enough, and that crying on camera or tweeting the right boycott or regretting a wedding venue long after the fact will somehow bend the arc of history. What's really happening is simpler. These are people who've confused being watched with being right, but these moments felt like a glitch, but it was really a preview. Because if you watched carefully over the next few years, that gap, the one between performance and principle, only widened. In 2024, Los Angeles was plastered with promotional posters for this movie, a film that claims to deconstruct a tired racial trope only by leaning directly into it. During its press tour, here's what Nicole Byer had to say.
Usually it's like a white lead, and then they're like, oh, the friend can be black, and then they make the friend black, and it's a friend who doesn't have their own life, and you're like, do you even have a home? Do you like go home and sleep?
The irony here is the movie she's promoting doesn't subvert the trope. It doubles down on it, repackages it with self-awareness, and sells it as progress. That's the trick now. You don't have to fix the problem. You just have to acknowledge it. Bonus points if you do it with snark. And if someone calls out the contradiction, you can just accuse them of missing the point. And Hollywood's gotten very good at that, presenting old flaws in new packaging and calling it bold. The 2022 Oscars might have been the greatest example of this. It should have been a return to form, a celebration of storytelling after the weirdness of the pandemic years, but it became a sermon, a slow motion TED Talk intercut with standing ovations. Topics range from voting rights to climate change to identity politics. There was applause for causes, hashtags for movements, and barely any time for the actual films. It ran long, viewership cratered. But it wasn't because audiences don't care about social issues. It's that they can tell when they're being preached at by people who don't live the sermon. And look, Hollywood's always had its contradictions, but it used to pretend better. Now, the seams are always showing. It's like how you'll hear A-listers advocate for sustainability, talk about climate change, and rail against carbon footprints. Then they take private jets to film festivals or ski resorts, or better yet, conferences. In 2022, Taylor Swift's private jet made over 170 flights, emitting roughly 8,300 metric tons of CO2, more than 1,000 times the average American. She later claimed many of those flights weren't hers. Okay, but the optics are the point. If you want people to take your moral messaging seriously, maybe don't board a Gulf Stream after tweeting about sea turtles or something. I used to think this is only about politics when it's sadly just about authenticity. People can smell the difference between conviction and choreography. They don't want perfection, but they want honesty. And when you lose that, you lose more than audiences. You lose cultural gravity, because eventually people stop listening, tired of being told what to care about by people who outsource their own morals to their PR teams. That's the crisis. More than wokeness, more than politics, the crisis is inauthenticity, a world where values are worn like seasonal accessories, where the most important causes in the world get flattened into branding exercises, and moral courage gets outsourced to an Instagram caption. And when you point it out, Of course, you're accused of not caring, but maybe the opposite is true. Maybe calling out the performance and virtue signaling is a form of caring. Maybe it's the only one left.
Most of you spent less time in school than Greta Thunberg. So, if you win, right, come up, accept your little award, thank your agent and your God, off.
There's a funny thing about silence. It used to be just that, silence. A blank space, a quiet moment, the thing between beats. But today it's a little suspicious. In this age where every brand, artist, studio, and streaming service is expected to make statements, silence reads like evasion, like complicity, like having nothing to say is more offensive than saying something dumb. And Hollywood, more than any other American institution, has taken that pressure and turned it into a business model. We've talked a lot about how you can see it in movies, not just what's cast or greenlit, but how the film itself behaves, like it knows it's being watched by someone other than the audience, a panel, a committee, a moral umpire somewhere just off screen. They told us the camera used to be a window. Now it's a mirror, and every character, every plot twist, every line of dialogue has to pass a kind of virtue inspection before it's allowed to mean anything. And it all started with consolidation, because when 6 companies control nearly everything you see, read, or hear, Disney, Warner, Paramount, Comcast, Amazon, Sony, the problem isn't just a lack of choice. It's that the entire creative process gets rerouted through corporate liability departments. And corporations, by nature, hate ambiguity. They want to avoid risk. And art, when it's good, is mostly risk. So, what fills the vacuum? I'd say alignment, moral choreography, not just representation, but performance. A way of being seen on the right side of history without the inconvenience of actually wrestling with it. These moments are cues, rituals, almost, not there to serve the story, but to serve the signaling. And still, what's strange is how the audience keeps pulling away. Viewership drops, box office tanks, franchises fumble, but the industry doubles down like the problem isn't really the message, but our resistance to it. Like we're not watching hard enough, not clapping loud enough. This is where Hollywood starts to look less like an entertainment machine and more like a church that's lost its congregation, but keeps rewriting the liturgy anyway. We've seen this before, actually. During World War II, the US government partnered with Hollywood to produce morale-boosting films, Casablanca, Yankee Doodle Dandy, and dozens of lesser-known reels filled with flag-waving and noble sacrifice. But the goal then was cohesion, not consensus. The stories didn't flatten people into causes. They inspired, complicated, uplifted. Now the mechanism is the same, but the intent has completely shifted. And in this new mode, disagreement is not healthy. If you object, you're admitting to how bigoted you are, which is why criticism of something like Netflix's Cleopatra, where the historical Egyptian queen was reimagined in a way that baffled actual Egyptian scholars, was not even met with debate, but with scolding. They called it representation, because they think that word resolves everything. Like history itself should sit down and shut up when a streaming platform wants to optimize its optics. But this is how we get posture that masquerades as progress. And the problem with posture is that it has no center of gravity. It tips too easily. You're probably sick of me always talking about rings of power, but the whole concept is so bizarre that it accidentally just keeps proving my point. $1 billion production built around a property that practically invented modern fantasy, and still the show seemed allergic to its own source material. But it's not just about failed reboots or lazy scripts, it's about how the industry defines value. Everything, everywhere, all at once was brilliant, yes, but it also checked every institutional box. Identity, trauma, family dysfunction, and philosophical disaffection. It was received as both a good film and an endorsement. Top Gun, Maverick, a sincere and unironic tribute to duty, excellence, and mentorship, made a ton of money, was still treated like it had shown up to the Oscars in cargo shorts. Both films succeeded, but only one was safe enough to celebrate, because one affirmed the rubric, the other didn't. And the awards, when they can help it, are always going to go with the side, with characters who are less white. And that's the quiet reprogramming happening beneath the surface. A shift not just in what stories get told, but what stories are allowed to mean. And it's everywhere now. So guys, Hollywood isn't collapsing because it's too progressive. It's collapsing because it forgot its job. Its job was never to save the world. It was to help us feel something, to laugh, to wonder, to argue on the drive home. But do they actually do any of that anymore? What's left after all the panels and think pieces and self-congratulating press tours is an industry that no longer trusts its own medium. It doesn't believe story can change people. It believes only shame can. But shame doesn't build audiences or worlds or culture. It just makes people quiet.